Hello guys, welcome to episode 2 of this asynchronous JavaScript course. In this episode, I'm going to show you how you can actually make API calls using callbacks. So in the previous episode, we introduced the concept of callbacks and we saw how to simulate an API communication scenario using a setTimer function. But in this episode, I'm going to show you how you can actually create write a code that connects to the backend API and then fetches some data. And that is going to be achieved using, as I said, like a simple API running on my local machine on port 3000, which exposes an endpoint for some objects, some task objects. We're gonna use XML HTTP request. In future episodes, I'm going to show you how to use Fetch API, which is, let's say, the modern version of communicating with APIs from JavaScript applications. So the objectives of this episode: we're going to learn how to make HTTP requests using XML HTTP requests. We're going to use callbacks and what we learned in the previous episode to handle the responses that API is going to return. The API is running on my local host on this port number, and this is the endpoint we're going to integrate with. And this is going to, the application is going to fetch those tasks in, let's say, in a callback-based asynchronous programming code, and then it's going to show the tasks that the endpoint returns. So let's talk a little bit about, XML HTTP request. So before modern tools like Fetch API or Axios, you can find tutorials about these two on my channel. So we used XML HTTP request object to make network requests. It's still valuable to understand how it works because it shows the callback based approach in action, and it kind of shows the problems that this approach is going to cause. So as I told you in the previous episode, the callback approach is the simplest method to asynchronous programming in JavaScript. And even though it is simple, it is going to cause many problems. And before Fetch and Axios, for example, we used to use XML HTTP request because it integrates very, very well with this callback based approach. So let's see how we can use XML HTTP request object to actually send a request to the backend API to fetch some data. So fetching some tasks from the JSON server with the XML HTTP request. We're going to create this file, episode2.js, and we're going to put this piece of code inside of it. And I have some explanation here as well. So this is the function that we have. So get tasks, which is an asynchronous function, and it is going to use XML HTTP request. So it kind of sends a get request to a local API, and on this condition, ready state equals 4, it checks the status. If the status is 200, it means that the data is ready, it has received a response, it can go on, parse the data, and send tasks to the callback that I'm going to show you. Otherwise, it sends an error, and the display tasks is going to log the task list or the error. So this is the callback that we're going to use. Display tasks is going to receive an error and tasks. So if the error has some value, is going to print the message of the error. Otherwise, for each task inside of that tasks, it's going to print this console log statement. So the title of the task and the status of the task. This is the callback, display tasks. And this is the asynchronous function that we're going to write. So it's going to, of course, take in the callback. It's going to create the XML HTTP request object. It's going to send a get request to this endpoint. And whenever, as I told you, whenever the ready state equals 4 and the status is 200, it means that there is a valid response to be parsed. So it's going to parse it, and it's going to call the callback, right, with null for the error and the tasks from here for the second parameter. Otherwise, if the ready state is 4, it means that there is some error because the status is not 200. So it's going to again call the callback, but this time for the first parameter is going to pass this error object, and for the second parameter is going to pass null. So if everything goes according to the plan, use the callback function to print the tasks. Otherwise, use the callback function to kind of console log, let's say, an error object. And then we're going to call the asynchronous function get tasks with this callback as the parameter. Now let's go to the code. I have already created the second branch. What I am going to do is to go to my index.html file. I'm going to change this to episode2.js, and I'm going to create episode2.js, and then I'm going to write the code. So I'm going to create this asynchronous function. By the way, my API is running on my local machine. So let's send the GET request, and then if we have this status code, let's parse the response and let's call the callback with null for the first parameter, which is the error, and tasks for the second one. Otherwise, let's call the callback with the error for the first parameter. Now this is it. Now let's create the callback. So 2 parameters, error, tasks. If the error is not null, let's print it out. Otherwise, let's print out the tasks. And finally, let's call the asynchronous function with this display tasks as the callback. And this is it. So I told you that I'm running the API on my local machine on port 3000, right? As you can see, I get the output of the task here. And of course, if I go ahead and like change this to 4000, it cannot connect to the API, and it's gonna print out this error. It says fail to fetch tasks. So this is the error that we are passing to the callback here, fail to fetch tasks. But if I change this back to the correct port number, it's going to connect to the backend API. Right now the backend API is only exposing this only single task object, and it's going to print it here inside of the console. So again, this is the simplest form of creating asynchronous code inside of JavaScript using callbacks. Back to the note, we already talked about the explanation. Now, this is how the callback pattern applies in a real asynchronous context. You start seeing how messy things can get when handling errors and nesting, which we will cover in next episode with the concept of callback hell, or the pyramid of doom. So as I told you, even though using callbacks seems to be very easy and very straightforward, when you want to implement some asynchronous code, they're not with problems. So they're going to cause a lot of issues for you when you nest different errors, and different, let's say, levels of indentations will appear in your code, and you're going to see that in the next episode. Let's wrap up this episode. So in this episode, we kind of made some real asynchronous HTTP GET request to a backend API using XML HTTP request object, and we handled it using callbacks. We could, of course, implement this using fetch or Axios. These are the things that I'm going to talk about in future episodes, but for the second episode, I decided to go with XML HTTP request. So this is it. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up as always, and share this with a friend, and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes as well. Bye-bye.